And welcome back to another episode of the Double Doink Podcast. My name is Brendan Deek. Thanks so much for tuning in today, guys. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. It would be greatly appreciated. You can also rate the podcast and review the podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. It would also be greatly appreciated. A really cool episode for you today. I have a guy on that I've been looking to talk to for a very long time. He is the former vice president of finance for the Green Bay Packers. He is currently working at Sports Illustrated as a writer there. Andrew Brandt is with me. Andrew, how are we doing?
I'm doing well, Brendan. Good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to jump on, man. Really appreciate it. So I guess we'll start with what your most recent work, and that kind of ties into my side of things as well. So you wrote an article about Jalen Hurts this week for Sports Illustrated. Why don't you, if you mind, tell the listeners, maybe summarize what you wrote about Jalen Hurts, what you learned about how kind of the process has been since Jalen Hurts has become a Philadelphia Eagle.
Yeah, I wrote as much about Carson Wentz as I did about Jalen Hurts. It just shows, I'm here in Philadelphia, and I've followed this very closely over the last 4 or 5 years. It just shows you the whole story of best laid plans. And the article also talks about the 49ers, which I'll get to in a minute. The plan was all Wentz. The Eagles were as all in on Carson Wentz as any team in the NFL has ever been all in on a player. They traded massive draft capital to get opportunity to draft Carson Wentz. They gave him the biggest contract for a young quarterback in history once they could. They traded Nick Foles, the Super Bowl winning quarterback who was his backup, was kind of a shadow over him, so they got rid of him. And then, of course, they gave him the keys to the franchise. One of the things they did, it sounds counterintuitive, Brendan, but to express their commitment to Carson Wentz was to draft Jalen Hurts. And the reason I say that is they got rid of an expensive backup in Foles, and they wanted a cheap backup. And what better way to get a cheap backup than a second-round pick? Now, that's not to say they didn't like Jalen Hurts, but this was a perfect opportunity. You're paying top dollar to Carson Wentz, so bring in Hurts as a backup. And that was the plan. Wentz was as all in as ever. They had a huge contract. It would take an enormous cap hit to trade him or release him or whatever. And then everyone knows the rest of the story. Carson Wentz, to me, had the most precipitous fall in the history of football, at least the modern history of football. I don't get it. And I'm not a football expert, but I was all in on him too. I thought he was big, strong, mobile, good head, incredible work ethic, smart. And no, he just went to the pits in 2020, and 2 teams later, it just seems like he has no football awareness whatsoever. He gets sacked at an alarming rate. That's the one side of it. And then the other side of it is the Eagles did make that move. They took on a $34 million cap hit. They get Jalen Hurts, and oh my God, he's been a revelation. He has an extraordinary ability to run a team. And just what I've seen the past 2 years, he has great awareness. He's got great strength. He doesn't have a super, an elite arm, but it's good enough. And of course, he brings the running threat. He is managing a stacked team right now. They're stacked on O-line. They're stacked on D-line. They got A.J. Brown now. They've got Darius Slay on the back end. That team is poised for greatness. And it just shows you the theme of my article is you just never know. They drafted Carson Wentz to be a backup. I'm sorry, they drafted Jalen Hurts to be a backup. And here we are, where he might be MVP of the league and Carson Wentz may be bottom 2 or 3 quarterback in the NFL. Mm-hmm. And that's where we are.
So I always had the mindset and the belief that, yes, the Eagles drafted Jalen Hurts to be a backup. I'm assuming that had something to do with it, but and you can maybe relate to this because you've been in a front office before. Drafting a quarterback in the second round to be a backup, in my opinion, is a very odd way to use your resources. It almost feels like, to me, and this can almost tie back to Howie Roseman. There's tons of data and tons of kind of radio hits and pressers to back this up, that Howie Roseman loves Russell Wilson. He was obsessed with Russell Wilson. He was enamored by him. He wanted to draft Russell Wilson. And when he missed out on that opportunity, when the Seattle Seahawks traded above the Eagles to grab him, he kind of still had this feeling that he wanted to find maybe the next Russell Wilson. And I think that Howie Roseman actually looked at Jalen Hurts as maybe he looks like Russell Wilson. He kind of plays a little bit like him. I just have a hard time believing that the only reason that the Eagles drafted Jalen Hurts is to be a backup. They loved what they saw in him. They loved the intangibles. They loved the leadership. They drafted him as a quarterback prospect that they believe that could be a starter in the NFL someday. Is that kind of along those lines, or?
Yeah, I don't believe it because of what they committed to Wentz. I mean, there's just no way that they're drafting a starting quarterback in 2021 or 2020 when they committed everything to Wentz. I mean, it's like if pick a name, if someone drafted someone to be starter in Kansas City or drafted someone to be a starter in the Chargers or in the Bengals. I mean, they committed everything to this guy.
Mm-hmm.
I will say this because you bring up Russell Wilson, and listen, Howie Roseman's a friend. Where I'm talking to you, he probably lives 2 blocks from here. You know, he can't get too much credit here because he did want Russell Wilson.
Yeah.
And maybe he wanted Deshaun Watson. And they were kind of like, yeah, maybe we'll commit to Jalen Hurts, but now they have no option. I mean, unless there's a dramatic downturn, he's going to be the guy and he's going to get a huge contract at this time next year. And that's where we are. And it's just, again, fortune. And the other part of the article, Brendan, was the 49ers. They are all in and still are on Trey Lance. They committed not 1, not 2, 3 number 1 draft picks. And when trading 3 number 1 draft picks, you don't even get Pro Bowlers for that. I mean, people don't even trade 3 number 1s for pro. Now they're trading it for a quarterback that hardly ever played in college, but they did. So Garoppolo was persona non grata. They tried to trade him for 6 months. They dumped his money from $25 million to $6 million. And lo and behold, Lance is the starter for 5 quarters and back to Garoppolo. And here he is. He's got a lot of bonuses that can get him up to maybe $12 million. But the 49ers are lucky here because they didn't trade him. And they had him for $25 million as a decent starter contract. Then they get him for $6 million on a nice backup contract for Garoppolo. Now he's on a really bad starting contract. And the 49ers get all the beneficiary of that.
What do you make of the moves that Howie Roseman has made to kind of maybe rebuilt his image? Because he, after the 2020 season, if you talk to majority Eagles fans, they didn't want him back. He has done an absolute sensational job of rebuilding this roster. Did you think he had this in him? Like, it's kind of crazy just to see the year and a half kind of complete.
Yeah, I think this is something that I take personally too, and this is a defense of him because, as you mentioned with my background, it's same as Howie. You know, we grew up together as people call us capologists, cap managers, vice president of player finance, vice president of player payroll, whatever it is. And our primary job was negotiating all the contracts. And there has been this bias, and you can tell me as much as anyone is if it's still there or not, that no, GM's got to come from scouting backgrounds. GM's got to be like all these other hires that just come from college scouting. And Howie's like, no, like you don't have to come from that because if you're a GM, you got to do a lot more than scout. And you really make your value by negotiating. And what Howie has shown the world in football, we can all debate whether this pick's good or that pick's good. He has negotiated superbly with other general managers. His trades, his signings contractually with agents, he's a cut above. So if I'm looking to hire a general manager, I may look at, you can get a great scout anywhere, but can you get someone that can continuously get positive deals out of other general managers? He did it on A.J. Brown, not only with the trade comp where Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill went for a 1 and a 2, he got them for like 1 and a 3. And then on the financial comp, he got A.J. Brown locked in like 5 years. The other one's got 2-3 years. So anyway, that's the value of a general manager like that. And I think, in my opinion, there should be more of them.
You can kind of almost pinpoint it to the rival in the NFC East, right? Like David Gettleman had kind of a scouting background. He was a football guy. And take a look at how that all went, right? And look at you probably needed a guy like Howie Roseman or yourself to kind of negotiate or help him with some of these contracts. Like Kenny Galladay right now, it looks like the worst contract in football. So you make a great point.
Well, that's that again. I'm going to show my Packer background here because that's Kenny Galladay is just one example of hundreds where people get excited about these marquee free agents signings and they never work out. Now, some do. Of course, you can't, stereotype them all, but most don't. And certainly not for the money they're being paid. And I know fans get excited in March, and I heard it for 10 years, Brandon. Why aren't you doing anything, Packers? Why aren't you doing? And I'm like, yeah, I mean, look at the Packers. Look, they picked up players like Rasul Douglas and Devondre Campbell off the scrap heap. And they're performing better than the $20 million a year free agents. So
we'll get to the Packers in a bit. I want to transition to the Carolina Panthers. I found their last 3-year strategy to be very interesting and good, and maybe a good case study. So the Panthers are 30th in EPA per play on offense since Matt Rule has taken over as head coach. So they've built, in my opinion, one of the worst offensive infrastructures that you can possibly build for a quarterback, for an offense since Matt Rule has been there. What do you make of the Matt Rule era? What could they have done differently? What do you think they maybe should have done? What do you make of this whole process with him? Because it's been nothing short of a disaster, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm probably more defensive about it than you are because
okay.
I don't know him, but I know of him. He certainly he came into this in a school where I am called Temple, which had
fight for the red and the white, baby,
which had very, very, very low program, and he took it to a high level. And then he went to Baylor, which was rocked by scandal, and he took that to a high level. So you would hope he could do that in the NFL, and that's why they hired him. And he had other offers besides Carolina, so he was in demand that year. It hasn't worked. Primarily, the obvious point, any fifth grader could tell you this, which is they haven't had a quarterback. They tried Bridgewater, they tried Darnold, and now they're trying Mayfield. Everyone knows they were as aggressive as anyone trying to get Deshaun Watson, and he eliminated them for whatever reason. So here we are. I think the future could be bright because they're 1-2, I believe, but they were, they lost on the last second, one game and lost by a point or two the other game. It could be 3-0, but we'll see. But yeah, I mean, he's on the hot seat. Like, these coaches that come in year 2, year 3, year 4 haven't won. They're all on the hot seat.
So I'm assuming that you probably find the New Orleans Saints, the way that they run their team, very interesting. And again, maybe another good case study to take a look at is how teams build their rosters. Right now, it's not looking so hot. Jameis Winston has a back injury that looks like it's nagging him. He hasn't even practiced in London earlier today, so that's something to watch out for. Andy Dalton might be getting the start. The Philadelphia Eagles own the New Orleans Saints first-round draft pick this year. Andrew, from your expertise of being in the front office, what do you make of how the Saints kind of do business, I guess is the best way to ask this, because they do it a lot differently than any other team in the NFL.
Yeah, what you're talking about is kicking the can down the road cap-wise. For people who don't know, you can take a big bonus. You can take a big salary of a player. You can bonus it out. So if a player's supposed to make $20 million and he's got 3 years left, you say, okay, we're going to give you that $20 million in bonus instead of salary. Bonus is treated as cap prorated. So instead of a 20 million cap, it goes to a 5 million cap, and 5 million is added to each of the next 3 years. They do that consistently. They did it every year with Drew Brees. They do it with other players, and they have a big bill at the end. And what happens is people say, well, fans of the Saints are always saying, yeah, I mean, we're going to just kick it down and we'll keep being good. And the problem is, you pay the piper, and I think they're counting Drew Brees, something like 25 million last year while he was working for NBC. You see what's happening. They lose a starting corner in Chauncey Gardner-Johnson because they can't pay him. They've lost other players to free agency. They just can't pay him. So there are consequences to that. It's not just, they're not just failing after Drew Brees due to not having Drew Brees. I think there's some problems there.
Do you think they should have traded all these draft picks and kind of maybe double down this year? Wouldn't have this been the perfect time to maybe just kind of rip off the Band-Aid and start from scratch?
Yeah, I would think, but again, I think they trade a lot of assets to get Chris Olave, and that's a receiver.
Yeah.
Again, I understand for a proven guy like AJ Brown, but yeah, that seems like a lot.
A lot of people have this term when they talk about the Saints and maybe the Rams and other teams, and I'm assuming you've heard this before. The salary cap is fake. A lot of people have thrown that term out. What do you make of that term?
Well, I think the salary cap can be fake if you're only concerned about this year. That when I was with the Packers, I'd have a coach or GM, people ask me on the street, can we do this? Can we do that? Can we get this guy? Can we that? And my answer is always the same. If you only care about this year, sure, we can do everything. But I'm a little more risk averse personally as a person, and that was just my thing. I wanted to take on as much cap as I could so we'd be more flexible in the future. So when we traded Brett Favre at the end of his career, our dead money charge was like $600,000. Now you see dead money charges, Carson Wentz, 34 million, Matt Ryan, $40 million is counting on the Falcons cap this year, highest charge in the league, and he's not playing for them. This is what gets you in trouble. And along those lines, Brendan, I totally disagree with the people that say, oh, you can't build a contending team with a $40 million quarterback. You absolutely can. Because think about a team right now. Probably 60% of your roster, 50 to 60% of your roster, think about that, is on rookie deals. And conservatively, say each of them has a cap number of $1 million. So that's 35 players, right? 35 million for 60% of your team. So now you have 175 million for the other 30% of your team. That's not hard.
Mm-hmm.
What gets you in trouble is what I just talked about, all the crap on the cap. The dead money for this guy or for that guy, or the extra money that you have on a quarterback because of all the restructures he's been doing. So that's the way I feel.
So the Denver Broncos, famously this offseason hired a new head coach. They hired Nathaniel Hackett. They brought in Russell Wilson, and they paid him. I think you had a tweet. Was it 2025? Russell Wilson's going to be making $55 million or something like that. I think you had a tweet around that. And his contract is baffling. Like if you take a look at the cap hits that are coming later, and like they are absolutely all in on Russell Wilson. I know it's been 3 games, Andrew, but you think they made the right call?
I think no matter how much they denied, I think they were all in on Aaron Rodgers, and they hired the Packers coach that was close to Aaron, and it didn't happen. And I think they transitioned to Russell Wilson. I'm not saying they did not want to trade for Russell Wilson. I'm saying they really wanted to trade for Aaron Rodgers, and Aaron, decided to come back to Green Bay, and here we are. Listen, I'm a fan of Russell Wilson. It's just a question of, is he going to get right in that offense? Is it going to look different in a couple of weeks, in a month than it does now? It's going to be back to being a very dynamic player. We haven't seen it yet, but let's see if we do. And as for the contract, I kind of criticize the contract actually, because, this is the standard refrain of what I've been talking about for 6 months. The question I had, the major question for me in my area, the business of football, was, is the Deshaun Watson contract going to be a precedent or an outlier? And unfortunately for future quarterbacks, the Russell Wilson deal kind of makes it look like an outlier, because here's Russell Wilson only getting the standard traditional 2 or 3 year guarantee and not a full guarantee like Watson. So the next test case is Lamar, and we can talk about that. But Russell's going to make a lot of money, but in 2-3 years, if they don't like him, they can get rid of him.
Yeah. So Nathaniel Hackett has not done a good job. I think it's fair to say that over the first 3 games, he made some kind of bad in-game decisions. I've actually talked to a couple people that have worked with him and have played for him, and they say that he's a great guy, happy-go-lucky guy.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not the best football mind and maybe not the best leader. In your time spending in front offices and talking to people, have you ever heard of like maybe a team just kind of like fully regretting a hiring like this early or anything like that? Like how long does it take for maybe a general manager, owner, and whatnot to kind of clue in and say maybe we made the wrong call here?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, I think that's something that probably takes more of a time, and unless there's just there's not buy-in. That's what's scary when you don't have buy-in from the player side. Um, there have been one and done coaches back to Cleveland with Chudzinski years ago. There have been Doug Marrone might have been a one and done. It happens, and that's what you're talking about. But unless there's some personal morality issue, I can't see it happening before a year. We'll see. I mean, listen, the Broncos, I think, are 2-1.
They are 2-1. They're I think one of the weirder 2-1 starts in NFL.
Yeah, it's like them and the Bears are like the worst 2-1 teams ever. But yeah.
Okay, Lamar Jackson, you brought that up. I want to talk
Yeah.
about this because I think he's in your mind. I'm assuming he's probably the most interesting guy to watch out for a new contract. He's about to get paid.
Yeah, and he's representing himself, and it's ironic because people say, "Oh, he should get an agent. He should get an agent." Well, he's the only one that has balked at being, shouted out about the Watson contract, that it's an outlier, it's an aberration. He's like, I don't think it is. And the agents for Russell Wilson or Kyler Murray or Derek Carr that have done deals since Watson, like, yeah, okay, it is. But he's bucking up against that, and he's betting on himself, and he's having a great year. The problem, and I wrote about this, I've talked about this on my podcast, the problem for Lamar is that he can't really bet on himself because of this mechanism the NFL has. It's terrible for top players. It's the tag. So Baltimore's got his rights next year. He cannot name his price next year. And that's unfortunate because, again, you only have so many years at a high level, and he may just continue to go through this, and they may say, hey, we're never going to do the Watson deal, and here we go. So I'm a Lamar fan. I'm actually impressed at his negotiating because he's just not going to fall for the tailpipe trick that all the other quarterbacks are falling for.
Did you ever negotiate with people that didn't have agents? Like,
Yes.
Yeah. What was it?
I found it very difficult, Brandon, because I thought it would be cool. These players would say, hey, Andrew, you're cool. You're a former agent. I don't need an agent. And it was very hard. I won't name names, but players would say it would wreck relationships, right? Because I'm telling them they're not as good as they think. I'm telling them they don't have the worth that they think they do. It's very raw and emotional. It was very hard. And I lost relationships, my wife and their wife, that whole thing, and I appreciated the value of agents. I really did, because they're a buffer, for tough talk.
How much do agents usually take from a contract?
Well, the max in football is 3%, but for superstars, they're not paying that. Even number one picks aren't even paying that. So if Lamar really wanted an agent, he'd have a line at the door for people that would probably do it for 1%, 0.5%, maybe flat fee, $50,000, something like that, just to be Lamar's agent. So I don't think that's the reason. If he's worried about money, he could get a cheap agent, a good agent for cheap.
Interesting. Okay, Green Bay Packers. So you worked for that organization for quite a while. You know this organization pretty well. They had a really interesting summer. They traded their receiver Devontae Adams for a first and second round pick. They, after signing their franchise quarterback to a big extension at an old age, it's kind of never really seen something like this before. In Green Bay. What do you make of how the Green Bay Packers have built their roster and everything that's kind of gone on over the last 6 months?
Well, I think they're great scouting. They have been since I was there. They seem to find these players I talked about earlier in this podcast about finding these players on the scrap heap that are now stars. Obviously, everyone knows we don't play big in free agency, don't have to. It's a draft and develop team. It's a team that develops its own and then pays them, as I did. They identify David Bakhtiari, pay him. They identify Jair Alexander, pay him. They identify Aaron Jones, pay him. So this is what happens. And then, of course, it's all governed by Aaron. in terms of his talent level. He just has a talent level I've never seen in the sport. And, you know, I knew Aaron a lot better when I was there and he was a young player. Now he's got a real thoughtfulness about him that really aligns with the way I think about things. I'm kind of a Zen guy myself, so I think it's cool. I think he brings a nice calm to that team, these young players. And I always predict big things for that team. They have been the most successful team in the NFL the past 3 years in the regular season, and you just got to see the playoffs. It's just been this weird thing with the block punt in the 49ers game, a crazy game a couple of years ago, crazier game a couple of years before that. It's just what Aaron's come up against is playoff games where the defense is letting up a lot of points or whatever it may be, the special teams. So it's unfortunate for Aaron. Everyone points to the lone Super Bowl, but I predicted before the season, I still do, that it's them and the Eagles in the championship game, and we'll see where it goes.
Are the Packers? I've always had this term to stick to the Packers. I've always thought of them as a pay-as-you-go franchise, if that kind of makes sense. Like you kind of explained a little bit too how they kind of pay their own talent. Am I wrong there, or because they kind of do?
That's always been cap strategy that I use, and they still use. Where if you have a guy you're paying $20 million, you'd want to get that cap number as close to 20 million as you can, so you're not just pushing it out. Sort of the opposite of what you talked about with the Saints and Rams, trying to pay as you go because you want to be flexible for the future. And I learned that with Brett because I knew we'd have to turn this team over to Aaron Rodgers, and you want a good team. You know, you don't want a team socked away with $40 million of dead money for Brett Favre. So that was always in the back of my mind. And listen, as everyone knows listening, we didn't have an owner, and I just tried to think, what would our shareholders want me to do in this situation? And I acted kind of that way. The Packers are like a public trust, and I appreciated the magnitude of what I was doing, running the entire player payroll for the team, player negotiations, salary cap management, because it was my lane. We had a lot of great scouts in that lane, and we all sort of did our thing.
Do you miss it?
I don't. I have a lot going on. I have a lot of interests. I sort of mentioned this sort of Aaron Rodgers thoughtfulness that I appreciate. I'm very into fitness and triathlons, and I do, I have a full-time job at Villanova, teaching and writing, and of course, all my other media pursuits, but I don't miss it. It's interesting. I've asked that a lot. I miss 3 days a year, where you have some huge win and you're flying back from a city with a big win, but then the next day you're up at 6 a.m. and you're bleary, but I don't.
Packers are a super interesting team this year. I think they've kind of gone against what they usually do. Like Aaron Rodgers is averaging 5.5 air yards per pass right now. That's dead last in the NFL. They're getting the ball out early. They don't have like the Devontae Adams they're used to. I'm super fascinated with that team this year. And
I think that'll change. I think they've got these great running backs, so they're going to rely on that. But once they get the kid Watson out there, speed receiver, I think that'll change.
So this is my last question for you before we go. And you might have kind of just answered it before, but what's the future look like for Andrew Brandt? What do you look to accomplish? What's on deck for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as I'm alive, I'll teach and I'll write. I look at this third chapter of my career. I was an agent. First chapter, I was team executive. Second chapter, this chapter I've been at for 10 years, and it's basically giving back the way I know, which is I'm not going to cure cancer. I'm not going to come up with a vaccine, but what I can do is lend my unique knowledge and insight, having been an agent, having been on the team side, having the ability to write and communicate to students, to readers, to listeners, to podcast listeners, whatever it may be. And I want to keep doing that. I'm developing my newsletter. I'm developing a premium part of my newsletter. I continue to speak at events. I do expert witness for litigation about player earnings. So I'm happy. You know, I know everyone asks me, when's the book? You know, I got to write the book at some point.
Yeah, sure you do.
You know, I'm writing columns and newsletters now, so one day I'll get to the book.
Andrew Brandt writes for Sports Illustrated, former executive of the Green Bay Packers. One of the most impressive guys that I've ever talked to on this podcast. Thanks for doing this. Before we go, plug in where the listeners can look at your work, find your work, follow you on social media, plug in anything you got.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. I've got my newsletter now I just mentioned. So you go to andrew-brandt.com. You get a free newsletter every Sunday morning. It's called My Sunday 7. Now, if you want to hear me every day, daily videos, weekly meetings, that's the premium part I mentioned. It's Sports Business League. So you go to andrew-brandt.com/SBL for Sports Business League, SBL. Of course, the podcast, The Business of Sports, my columns at Sports Illustrated, and wherever you find me, I'm out there. I'm very active on Twitter. And of course, I do reels every day on Instagram. So Andrew Brandt 2 is the Instagram. I think that'll do it.
Thanks so much for doing this, man. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Brendan.